I first want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank our panelists for being here. Both SATSA and the International Law Society have a reputation of bringing in some of the most prominent figures in international law, national security law, and national security studies. Fortunately for us on this topic, we didn't really have to go too far to bring anyone in. I had to look no further than the fourth floor of the law school and cross the walkway to Maxwell to find really some of the most recognized authorities on the Middle East and national security studies and national security law. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel. First to my left, we have Professor William Banks. Professor Banks is currently both a professor of law and a professor of public administration here at Syracuse, at the College of Law, and at Maxwell. He is a Board of Advisors professor, is the founding director of the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism, and is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal on National Security Law and Policy. Professor Banks is an internationally recognized authority in international law, counterterrorism, and constitutional law. Professor Banks has helped set the parameters for the emerging field of national security law since 1987 and has co-authored two leading texts in the field, National Security Law, which is currently in its 5th edition, and Counterterrorism Law, which is currently in its 2nd edition. Professor Banks received his undergraduate education at...
let's move on.
Not a problem. I will say, Professor Banks, thank you very much for all the support you've given to our organization in the past. We certainly cannot do this without you. Sitting to Professor Banks' left is Professor Boroujerdi. Professor Boroujerdi is an associate professor of political science at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, where he also serves as the founding director for the Middle Eastern Studies program, and is the current president of the International Society for Iranian Studies, the leading academic organization in the world dealing with Iran. Dr. Boroujerdi received his undergraduate education at Boston University with a degree in political science and sociology and his PhD in international relations from the American University in Washington, D.C. His doctoral dissertation won the Foundation for Iranian Studies Award in 1990 for the best dissertation in the field of Iranian studies.
You can go on to it.
I gotta brag about you. And Dr. Boroujerdi is recognized as one of the world's foremost experts in Iran and in the Middle East. Thank you again very much for being here. To his left, we have Professor Miriam Elman. Professor Elman is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Maxwell and one of the faculty research directors for the international and interstate conflicts at the Program for the Advancement of Research in Conflict and Collaboration, also known as PARC. Dr. Elman is also the director of the Project on Democracy in the Middle East at the Moynihan Institute for Global Affairs and a member of the advisory board and steering committees for the Judaic Studies Program, the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism, and the Middle Eastern Studies Program. Professor Elman has written extensively on the Arab Spring, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, religion and politics, and international security. Would you like me to go into your education, or should I pass? Professor Elman does have a bachelor's degree in international relations and English literature from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a master's of philosophy and political science from Columbia, as well as a PhD in political science from Columbia. And last but certainly not least, Dean Steinberg is the dean, as many of you know, is the dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs here at Syracuse. He is a university professor of social science, international affairs, and law. Prior to becoming dean in 2011, he was Deputy Secretary of State, serving as the principal deputy to Secretary Hillary Clinton from 2005 to 2008.
You can stop there, too.
Will do, yes, sir. So before we start, I'm going to give just a quick one-pager. I know most of you know what has happened in Syria. A quick one-pager of the history from really the spring of 2011 to now, leaving out most of the middle so we could save time. It is a one-pager, though it's back in front. I'm getting old, it's size 16 font. So nevertheless, the conflict initially began as a civil uprising involving minor protests, beginning as early as January of 2001 as part of the Arab Spring, and in large part in response to government corruption and human rights abuses. Large-scale unrest began in March of 2011 in the southern city of Daraa, and later spread nationwide. The government responded to the protests with large arrests, torture of prisoners, police brutality, and large-scale censorship. However, the protests continued to grow. In late April of 2011, President Assad began launching large-scale military operations against towns and cities where sizable resistance movements were present. The operations involved use of tanks, infantry carriers, and artillery, and eventually led to large-scale combat between the Syrian army and protesters, mainly the Free Syrian Army. As of January 2nd, 2013, the United Nations had estimated that 60,000 people had been killed since the Civil War began. 4 months later, the UN estimated that the death toll of the conflict had reached 80,000. Around the same time, Britain and France informed the United Nations that there was credible evidence that Syria had previously used chemical weapons against rebel forces. By June of 2013, the United Nations estimated that the continuing violence in Syria had risen to death toll nearly 93,000 people, and the United States on its own concluded that the Syrian government had in fact used chemical weapons to fight against rebel forces. On August 21st, 2013, the Syrian opposition accused the government of once again launching a chemical weapons attack in Damascus suburbs that killed nearly 1,500 civilians. On August 26th, UN chemical weapons inspectors attempted to visit one of the Damascus suburbs that was allegedly hit with poisonous gas. The convoy carrying the inspectors came under sniper fire in its first attempt to access one of the affected towns. The next day, senior U.S. officials reported that President Obama was weighing a military strike against Syria that would be limited in scope and duration. On August 31st, President Obama said the U.S. had a moral responsibility to respond forcefully in Syria, and that while he retained a constitutional power to order military involvement in response to such attacks, he would not do so until Congress had a chance to vote on the use of military force. However, on September 9th, Russia and Syria welcomed an idea that the Syrian government could avert a U.S. attack by placing its chemical weapons under international control. And on September 14th, an agreement on Syria's chemical weapons was reached between U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. The reported purpose of the agreement is the total destruction of Syria's chemical capabilities and its components. It included a short and inflexible timetable, which was set for implementing the agreement to include 1 week for President Assad to report the extent and location of the Syrian chemical weapon arsenal, a month and a half for inspectors to inspect the site, and 9 months to complete the disarmament process. So with that in mind, first question to the panel is, what are your general opinions on the events which have taken place, specifically from April, when Britain and France first recognized that there was credible evidence of a chemical weapons attack? And more specifically, were you surprised with the international response and the United States response to the allegations? And Professor Steinberg, I believe we can start with you. So.
Obviously, it's a big question, and I first of all want to appreciate the fact that so many of you come out here. This is a challenging time for the international community, which is full of both risks and opportunities, as we like to say. And I think the big question here is how much and how appropriate it is to see this problem through the lens of the problem of chemical weapons and use of chemical weapons, and how much it needs to be seen through the lens of the broader political security issues taking place in the region. I think the biggest surprise, to my mind here, was Assad's decision to use chemical weapons. I think that if you look at the dynamic that was taking place, for better or for worse, there had been limited international direct involvement in this conflict. And because of that, Assad's position had appeared to be getting stronger on the battlefield. The opposition didn't have either the resources or the capabilities to really deal with the Syrian military. And so one has to ask the question about what was the motivation behind the use of chemical weapons, because it clearly did change the dynamics, both in terms of the support or the willingness to stay out of the conflict by the international community, and also by changing the subject, as it were, to something like chemical weapons, which are universally abhorrent. It has put Assad in a much worse position. So I think that clearly did change the dynamic, both because it made the prospect of further outside involvement greater, and it much further delegitimated Assad. Some people before could say, well, they're both bad guys, or they're extremists on the opposition side, and so it's kind of a civil war with no good actors. But given the use of chemical weapons, and particularly the history of chemical weapons used by Syria before, I think it did put new pressures there and opened the door to a new set of interventions. Now, whether they work out or not, I assume is something we're going to talk about going forward. But I do think it's changed the dynamic, both in terms of the conflict in Syria and also the way in which the international community is responding to it.
Let me just see if I can also interject a little scholarship, too, in the discussion. So I think that what's really interesting about this episode, and particularly since April, is, how do international issues and problems get framed as national security problems? And if you think about it, it really took this particular event, the use of sarin gas by the Assad government, the death of 1,400 plus innocent civilians, to finally make this a U.S. national security issue. And for years, the president and many in the administration really had not put this crisis, the Syrian crisis, as a threat that would require, American intervention. And so in a way, the decision to intervene, which might have been more opportune early on when there was a pro-democracy, homegrown, pro-American opposition movement, was sort of taken off the table, and now the administration was forced to consider intervention at a time which was much less opportune. So I think what this really shows, in a sense, non-decisions are in fact decisions, and they can later require much more costly action. And in a way, for me, the last 2 years of the Syria crisis was a little bit like Kevin Bacon's 6 Degrees of Separation. What action, what development will actually lead the U.S. And the administration to view this as a threat to vital American national security? So not 50,000 dead, not 75,000 dead, not 100,000 dead, not 6 million people displaced. But what about the fact that Al-Qaeda is on the border with Turkey, a NATO ally? So that doesn't do it. What about the fact that the opposition is hijacked by Al-Qaeda? That doesn't do it. It took this episode to do it, and I think that in itself is really an interesting question for foreign policy decision making.
So I woke up on the wrong side of the bed today, and as such, I've decided to be a bit provocative and try to think outside the box. Let me first respond to the way you framed the question. I have both political and moral problems with looking or reducing the Syrian conflict merely to this issue of the use of chemical weapons, right? Because I think it's a no-brainer that if we do not look at the larger context, we are going to miss the boat, right? About putting this episode in a larger frame. So, and also on moral grounds, I have to ask myself, why this infatuation with 1,500 casualties as if the 100,000 or so who were killed before them by conventional weapons seem to have been escaping our attention? Why this sudden sensitivity about this issue, right? So let's look at the jungle as well, rather than the tree, if you really want to address the issue of the Syrian conflict. And I think there are really some rather troubling questions, right? U.S. national interest, in my view, doesn't just come down to the issue of who used chemical weapons and how should they be punished. I mean, there are colleagues here who are better qualified than me to address the legal dimensions of this issue. But, I still am troubled by the rush to judgment that the White House demonstrated when this story first broke. We were not even willing to wait for international verification by UN or others. And all of a sudden we jumped to on this bandwagon of, this is going to be a military response, right? And again, this leads me to my next provocative question or argument, and that is, look, the situation in Syria, as I see it, is quite fluid, uncontrollable, and I don't believe that the U.S., contrary to what Washington likes to claim, is the indispensable power that is going to solve that problem, right? What seems to have characterized Obama's policy on Syria so far is ad hocism, right? He's making the rules, making the policy as he goes, okay? And that's not quite reassuring to some of us who have been studying this region for quite some time.
I'd add just a couple of points. I think one of the ironies, well, let me first say that I think the use of the term fluid or fluidity is maybe captures Syria better than any other term right now. It changes daily. So it's hard to make predictive judgments. It's hard to evaluate the situation there from day to day. I think one of the ironies now here in in late September is that despite the fact that Assad seemingly weakened his position dramatically when he chose to use chemical weapons, if the CWC deal works out, and it's a big if they're successful at joining the treaty, and if the deals for inspecting and disabling the weapons come to fruition, I guess we'll talk more about that, his position may be strengthened. He may have a longer term and a different legacy in that region of the world because he used CW. That strikes me as deeply ironic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I would like to talk about the actual proposed agreement from September 14th. And we've seen from our own experience and through the efforts to disarm Gaddafi Libya in the past that the process of destroying chemical weapon stockpiles is arduous and can often take decades. Do you think that the proposed disarmament agreement, as it is currently structured, is feasible? And what does success look like to the United States point of view? And how can regional powers, specifically the Arab League, potentially help with disarmament, with ensuring disarmament? And spoken to the panel, I don't know if anyone specifically wants to start.
So I think it's important as you think about this to recognize that even the United States has not complied with its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Treaty. So we're now, 15 years after the United States ratified the CWC, and we're substantially out of compliance with our own obligations. So the notion that they're actually going to get rid of this stuff in this kind of timetable is fancy, both for technical and resource-related reasons. But I'm not sure that's the big question here. I think the big question here is, first of all, does this substantially reduce the risk that they get used again in this conflict, which I think the answer is, if implemented, yes. And second, does this strengthen the overall chemical weapons regime? And I think the answer to that is also yes. I mean, whatever, and we can debate the broader issues about whether there should have been a response to the underlying civil war or not. But I think it is notable that on this issue, the international community does come together. Even Iran, the principal backer of Syria, has found it necessary to come out publicly and criticize the Syrian regime for using chemical weapons. It's understandable given the fact that chemical weapons were used against Iran. And so in the narrow sense, in the way this has been framed, I think the agreement, if even implemented only in terms of monitoring the stockpiles, does have a significant impact. But again, it has to be seen in that narrow context, which is, does this reinforce the CWC? Absolutely. Does it demonstrate that the international community will act in response even to a non-signatory? I mean, this is a country which has no obligations under the CWC, right? I mean, we do, and we're out of compliance. Syria doesn't because it never signed it. And yet, this is an instance where, in terms of the evolution of international law, that you don't have to be a signatory for this to be, essentially, you're obliged to comply, irrespective of whether you signed or not.
I would just add, I totally agree, and I would just add that, I think that the fact that this did become a collective international effort to uphold the norm, requiring the use of CBW, and I think that, that is important, and that in fact the norm has been strengthened, that despite all the other issues that Russia and the U.S. face, they were able to get, an agreement, and we'll see what happens with the Security Council, if it will have teeth, and what kind of teeth it would have, and what kind of sanctions would be in place for non-compliance by the Assad regime. That's all still up in the air. But I think that if there is a silver lining here in all this, it is that. It is that the norm against the use of chemical and biological weapons has been strengthened.
So 3 points. First, if you were to broaden the argument a bit first, and then addressing the concrete questions, I think we need to ask ourselves, why is it that a state like Syria would want to have chemical weapons in the first place, right? And under what conditions are they being done? Having learned from the experience of Iraq, remember, after Saddam was captured, all those documents were in the hands of U.S. forces. We learned that Saddam wanted to have chemical weapons because of his worried about his next-door neighbor, Iran. That was his incentive, right? In the case of, and that same logic about fearing the other regional neighbors, right, and what they can do to you, I think has motivated all sorts of other states. Iran in terms of its nuclear issue, and Syria in terms of its relationship with Israel. In other words, for the Syrians, holding on to the chemical card could have been the one saving argument they had against a nuclear-powered Israel. Right? So, if that's the logic, then my guess is that what we are going to see is going to be a game of cat and mouse, just like we saw in Iraq, right? Between the Syrian government and the inspectors. And the Syrian government would do everything within its power to hold on to some of these weapons as insurance policy for future, right? If there is going to be a future involving Mr. Assad at the helm, right? And therefore, that's what I expect. And needless to say, taking care of all these chemical weapons under a condition of a brutal civil war is going to be next to impossible to do. Finally, since Jim brought up the issue of Iran, let me also say, please understand why is it that many people in the Middle East do not necessarily buy the logic for this, going after Syria for its use of chemical weapons, right? Because their argument is, well, in instances where this type of weapons were used before against the U.S. adversary, we kept our mouth shut, right? And they are referring to the case of the Iran-Iraq war. So you would have a hard time convincing people in the region that this is not just another fig leaf justification, because it's not consistent with the historical record, okay? At least in that part of the world, or it's a selective use of this argument. So, in short, I think one thing that I often see in terms of the discussions in this country, the media coverage, and then when you glance at what goes on in the region, is that there seems to be sort of in many instances a dialogue of the deaf taking place. That they do not see things through the same prism that people here do. And we want to adamantly insist that they should see it our ways. And I don't see the logic.
There are only a couple of certainties, it seems to me, that are part of the deal that's being made about chemical weapons and Assad. One is that he will lie, and another is that he will delay. If you add to those inevitabilities conditions on the ground in the midst of this horrific civil war, getting a CWC-sanctioned monitoring and inspection team doing their work inside Syria is a tall order. It's very difficult to imagine that occurring. They're not going to go in under heavy fire. And creating the space for them to work and then the facilities for them to get the work done on a consistent basis over a period of weeks and months and maybe dragging into years looks like a very tall order to me.
I think, though, it's worth, Mehrzad, I think, correctly asked us to look at the experience with Iraq, because it is our one example of having international inspectors here. And I think the irony is, I think Mehrzad's argument is absolutely right, that Assad will have a significant impulse not to be seen as being denuded of its kind of weapons. But ironically, the other lesson of Iraq was not simply that Saddam needed to look like he had them, but also he didn't have them. And so the interesting question will be, how does Assad walk this fine line, which is on the one hand having an interest, for the reason Mehrzad saying, not looking like he's without retaliatory options. On the other hand, the risk of being caught and the danger that there'll be actions taken there. So the Iraq experience cuts both ways. It both demonstrates why you could hardly expect him to completely say, fine, no problem, take them all. On the other hand, the actual effectiveness of the approach to leading to the chemical stocks being dismantled.
Do any of you think that this agreement can actually be a solution to the broader crisis in Syria?
It's not designed to. Whether it becomes a springboard to it depends very heavily on how other actors respond to it. So, for example, we have this nominal international agreement, the so-called Geneva I agreement, to move forward with a political process. And the premise of Geneva I is that Assad goes as part of it. Now, if Assad's backers, Russia, Iran, and others, are prepared to sign up and use their influence to do it, maybe that does lead to something. But I don't think you could draw any immediate conclusion from this that will change the political calculation of the others about the underlying conflict.
I do, because we are co-sponsoring this with the International Law Society, I would be remiss if I did not ask the international law question with Professor Banks and Steinberg here. So with that said, there are some who think that Syria's use of chemical weapons is a violation of international law per se. Do you agree with this statement? And if so, what responsibilities do signatories have under the Chemical Weapons Convention in addressing these violations by Syria, even though they're not signatories?
It is a violation of international law, there's no doubt about it. The problem in international law is that there aren't remedies that are tagged to the violation. The Security Council can impose remedies, but short of that, and short of a CWC, Chemical Weapons Convention, mechanisms that may eventually have some benefit, there's no legal basis other than something we can talk about, humanitarian intervention, that theory, for responding to their use.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that, it's not an accident that both in the CWC and in the response to this, that countries may be willing to go so far as to set up a norm about what behavior violates international law, but they're very loath to actually then cede to others the ability to decide what the remedy should be. And so CWC is not self-enforcing. It does not call on or give authority to states to do anything about violations of it. And to the extent that this is a violation of humanitarian law, as it clearly is, kill a bunch of civilians, that violates international law. There's no self-executing mechanism to do that. Quite the opposite. As Professor Banks said, the formal structure really does require either action by the Security Council or more advanced concepts involving international law to justify the response.
I just may piggyback on this ILAW question with the responsibility to protect issue, the R2P issue, and how the Syrian crisis in general implicates R2P. I personally think R2P has come in for a heavy hit in the past few years of this crisis. I teach international security. I have a few weeks on humanitarian intervention, human security, responsibility to protect, and we go through the literature. And you'd think if you read all this literature and all these articles in the academic conferences that there was this established customary norm now, in international law to protect innocent civilians that are being slaughtered by their states, by the state apparatus. I think what the Syrian crisis shows is there's way too much hype about responsibility to protect. And the cold reality is that most of the time, and in the democratic public, which would be the great power democracies that would be doing the intervening to save these lives, there's not much interest in saving strangers unless the national interest is implicated, right? Unless there is, a serious risk to vital security interests. And so I think what this whole crisis shows, in a sense, is that responsibility to protect is, in a way, an option. It's not legally binding, and it's certainly more morally reprehensible to stand by passively when innocent civilians are being slaughtered by their state. But I don't think that the constructivist IR community should be breaking out the champagne bottles here, even though Russia turned to the UN, and even though diplomacy was used rather than use of force. This isn't time to be, congratulating ourselves. The responsibility to protect still has a really long way to go.
I think to be fair, it was always a debate about responsibility to protect, never an obligation to intervene, right? So even under its most advanced articulations in the UN statements and the like, it was a constraint or a codicil on the sovereignty understandings of the UN Charter, which is that countries could forfeit the attributes of sovereignty and the protections of sovereignty if they didn't meet their obligations to protect their own citizens. But even in the most enthusiastic advocates have done so, therefore every country in the world is obliged to intervene. So I think that's always been a challenge. Is that even if you accept the idea that the international community has some authority to take action here, the question of collective action and how you decide is quite important. And this gets back to this question that earlier was into the question of the United States as an indispensable nation. Is if you can't get consensus in the Security Council, and who's going to do it, and how will we decide under what circumstances the responsibility exists? Is it the neighbors? Is it the regional organizations? That, I think, has always been the conundrum for a responsibility to protect, is that it's clearly an evolution of the way we think about sovereignty and the right of non-interference, or the protection of non-interference. But it still doesn't answer the question of what do you do with it.
And in his talk at the United Nations, President Obama had a line that said, "Sovereignty is no shield for tyranny." Right? So again, I think we need to think about, as Miriam said, about the academic literature and the policy implications of adopting this as the guiding principle for designing foreign policy, particularly in regard to this peculiar region of the world with its formidable set of problems.
I would like to ask 2 more questions before I open it up to the audience for your own questions, so I hope you're thinking of them. Professor Boroujerdi, we've heard a number of panelists mention Iran already. And could it be said that this whole situation has as much to do with Iran as it does with Syria? And that this administration's impetus to use force is really about sending a message to Iran that the development of weapons of mass destruction, the use of weapons of mass destruction has consequences?
Yeah. Right. So we hear that argument a lot. And of course, I'm not here to defend the Iranian government. But I think history tells me that if we reduce the complexity of what is taking place in Syria right now merely to outside interference, we are missing the boat, right? What is going on in Syria over the last 3 years is a civil war. A civil war that is raging because the two sides have vested interests and want to adamantly defend their positions. There is a lot at stake, right? Surely, I like to tell my students, Middle East is no Las Vegas. What happens there doesn't stay there. Okay. So, events in one country, of course are going to attract, neighboring states. In Syria, as in the case of the Lebanese civil war of the 1970s and 1980s, right? All the neighboring states have their hand, in the pot, right? Surely, the Americans, the Israelis, the French, the Turks, the Qataris, Saudis, Iranians, everybody, right, has an interest in Syria. So, to argue that Syria is able to be maintained because of Iranian influence, I think is nonsense. I mean, this week's New Republic has an essay on the head of the revolution, head of the Quds Force, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards commander who apparently is helping the Assad regime, and they say this guy is what is holding the Syrian regime together. I mean, come on, this is in my view, journalistic exaggerations that might sell the journal, but doesn't take us a step ahead to solve the problem. Right? Does Iran have vested interests in Syria? Yes. Are they on the wrong side? Okay. Here I want to, again, be provocative. Okay, and propose the following argument. 30 years ago, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, Jim Kirkpatrick, came up with an argument that myself and many others were very critical of back then. The argument was, if you are given a choice between authoritarian states and totalitarian states, we should support authoritarian states because there is the likelihood of change there, whereas in totalitarian states there is no likelihood of change. So let's support them, right? She was, criticized for that argument. As I said, I was among them. Later on, now I look back and I think, well, she had a point, right? And I want to make the same argument here. Is it not true that when we look at the Middle East, at the end of the day, we are going to be better off with secular authoritarian rulers, a la Mr. Assad, even, right? Than the extremist elements We have seen what these guys can do once they come to power. We are already witnessing what they can do, even before coming to power, right? Taking out the heart of a Syrian soldier and eating it. Right? So I think we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is this? What are we getting into? Right? My argument is that, for once, actually, the argument that the Iranians and the Russians are making is the right one. I think instead of criticizing Putin, we owe him a debt of gratitude. He saved the United States from the quagmire of Syria, right? And I think, instead of just bashing Putin, let's think about, what it would have meant in light of Afghanistan and the experience of Syria. So, in short, my response to your question is, there is no remedy to this conflict than a diplomatic solution. But a diplomatic solution will entail the participation of the actors in the region. You cannot wish them away, right? Be it Iran, be it Turkey, be it Saudi Arabia, these guys are too powerful, okay, and they have a hand in the honey jar, right? And they want to be there. We need to acknowledge this. Surely you can go it alone, right? But we learned that lesson in some recent experiences of that, right? So let's think about what a diplomatic solution to this thing will mean. Yes, I don't want anyone to go away from this room with the impression that I in any way justify what Assad has done or killed 100,000 people. Even one casualty is way too many, right? But we also, as scholars, as policymakers, we also need to think about the ramifications. Is anyone here going to tell me with a straight face that if this opposition comes to power post-Assad, right, we are not going to see ethnic and religious genocides taking place against the Christians, Alawites, the Kurds, and so forth? Right? Are we going to sit here 10 years from now and look at Syria and say, that Assad guy, despite his rhetoric, he didn't really start a war with Israel over the Golan Heights, right? For example. He didn't go about invading his neighboring states, right? He didn't make Golan into a fatwa or a religious jihad, as the opposition might do. So let's be careful about what is really at stake here. And this simplistic good guys, bad guys portrayal of Syria that I see really troubles me.
So I think we can go off in a lot of direction here, and I think for all of you this is a very important debate because I think that there are some fundamental questions here, and I have to say I appreciate Mehrzad being provocative. I couldn't disagree more. I think that, to be honest, Mehrzad, to my mind, that's an argument that says we should have stuck with Louis XVI because of Robespierre. And yes, there are risks. There's no doubt about it. But the changes that are taking place are such that the notion that we're going to hide behind secular authoritarians and brutal secular authoritarians in the Middle East, I think, is a fantasy of the past and really misjudges what the long-term interests of the United States are and the trajectory of the region. And we
are already doing that. Look, we allowed the coup in Egypt to go on. These secular guys came back to power and we kept our mouth shut.
But the notion that we allowed the coup to go on, what would the United States have done that would have prevented the coup? So I think the question of what posture we should have to that is the right debate. But I think that I disagree with Jean Kirkpatrick then and still disagree with her because I think that, and not just for issues of values and principles, but they're extremely important. The credibility of U.S. foreign policy is rooted in values, and we have betrayed it. I'm not saying we haven't been consistent, but I think the notion that somehow we can protect our long-term interests by getting behind even relatively benign autocrats, which Assad clearly isn't, and we've known for 20 plus years. It isn't the first time, right? That he's used chemical weapons on his own people. But I think that the question of how to manage these transitions and our ability to manage them, they are, and I'll go back to my observation about the French Revolution. It's also legendarily said by Joe Enlai, when asked what you think about the French Revolution, he said it's too soon to tell. So these are long-term events, but the question is how we need to position ourselves to it. And we see this now in Bahrain, we see this in Saudi Arabia. I think it's unsustainable and not in the interest of the United States to think that somehow that there is this kind of solution that can hold back the tides of change, keep them in their box. I think we made a mistake, in my judgment, for not getting involved with the opposition earlier, because I think we've increased the risk that Mehrzad has talked about. But the notion that Putin clearly believes that somehow you can get behind these guys and you can, and therefore defeat Al Qaeda and extremism, I think is not correct.
I would just add that it would be nice to see the United States standing on the side of the angels for once. And I agree with Jim that, and I guess I have to agree with, I lived in Arizona for a while. I had problems with McCain, but I think, Hillary also supported the McCain decision that intervention for the homegrown opposition movement a few years ago, maybe, we don't know, right? There's a lot of chance, a lot of things we can't predict in advance, but it might just have led to a democratic transition. Now there's no good options. I mean, that's the problem of the non-decision, right? The decision to just stand on the sidelines. Bahrain is a travesty. The fact that we have left a legitimate opposition high and dry to its own fate, they're being tortured there. This is not standing on the side of angels, and it will come back to haunt us later. The fact that the region sees us as unable to support those that support our values. On the issue of Iran, I don't want to get into Iran because my friend Mehrzad is the expert. But just on the issue of the credibility, that what we heard in this whole debate is if we don't act forcefully in Syria, that somehow our enemies, Iran and others, will learn that any threats we make are not credible, that our deterrence will be hollow, and we won't be able to deter Iran. To me, that smacks of the now debunked domino theory, and the contexts are totally different. So what we do or didn't do in Syria is not going to make any difference with what's going to happen in other places. And states know that, right? I mean, this notion that somehow our credibility is already to say we have to act here because otherwise dominoes are going to fall elsewhere is just ridiculous.
Why is that?
Why is it ridiculous? Because the contexts are different. I think other states know that.
It may be wrong. It may be wrong, but is it ridiculous?
Well,
I think that's this again, for all of you, this is very important because the question of deterrence theory and credibility is one of the most challenging issues of our time. And so everybody's got their paradigms. You either have a Vietnam paradigm or a Munich paradigm. So I from my perspective,
Vietnam paradigm.
but I think the question, I think you're right to say there's a question about, in this case, does credibility or the lack of it in this case apply in Europe? But I wouldn't just dismiss it out of hand. I mean, I think the problem is unpacking this both as a historical matter and a theoretical matter is when does it matter? When do people make judgments about credibility and intervention? And I think this is so challenging, right? Because we know, it's somewhere in the middle, right? It's neither always the case that failure to respond in any case, irrespective of the context, undermines your credibility everywhere. But it's also the case that people do pay attention. And we know that people pay attention, and not just in Iran. I mean, one of the interesting things about this current phenomenon is the anxiety that it's causing for U.S. allies in East Asia, who are looking at this and saying, well, what about for the Japanese? What about the Senkakus, right? Are these islands that are disputed between China and Japan? If the United States feels like, well, we don't need to hear, well, yes, they have security interests, but they obviously, there's not a really big interest in the Senkakus. So what about that Article 5 commitment there? So I think, I agree with you, we shouldn't go immediately to say, right, we lost our credibility, it's gone, or we can't draw the distinctions. But I also wouldn't say, that all of the issues around credibility and deterrence theory are irrelevant to how states make these calculations.
I have one more question before we open it up, and that is, President Obama first called for President Assad to step down in August of 2011. President Assad fully meets the terms of a disarmament agreement. Should the official United States position still be regime change in Syria, and what consequences would this have to bringing members of the Assad regime to the ICC? Or I can move on to another question. questions. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? I hope so. Yeah.
Professor, I can't pronounce your last name.
Don't worry.
I'm glad that you mentioned the religious factor in Syria being one of the most ancient lands in our history of the Islamic faith, Christianity, and Judaism. So I do believe that a religious war is brewing, but that's not my question. But I want to thank you for bringing religion into it. My question relates to, in 2009, Israel used chemical weapons against an attack on Palestinians, but against a United Nations effort for peace and humanity, but the United States didn't get involved in that. But now all of a sudden, Syria, there's claims against Syria for the same thing, and now we're all in an uproar. Like, when does the United States have the ability to choose who we get to police and who we don't? Because obviously Israel said, oh, we apologize, it was a grave Masera, and people were hurt, people died. And now we're saying to Syria, okay, we're coming in and we're going to help and we're going to do this and claim a missile attack. But who gets to decide, or which country do we pick and choose to help, even though they're doing the same thing just in Israel? Because they apologize, it makes it right. And because Syria did it, we say, okay, we're coming for you.
Frankly, I'm not aware of the instance that you're talking about.
The white phosphorus in the Gaza war.
Look, I think that here is what we need to, the way at which I think about these issues. This whole issue of weapons, how consistent are we in terms of legislation and so forth, is really a political minefield, right? Just let me remind you, last Friday, there was the annual meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they were going to vote on a series of Arab states had brought out a proposal about making the Middle East a nuclear-free zone, right? This was a proposal that Egypt floated back in 2010. We were supposed to have a conference about it in 2011, whatever. It has not yet happened. The U.S. basically said, we're not that interested in such a meeting unless, and the idea of talking about the nuclear-free Middle East is unfeasible until serious progress has been made on the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Iranian nuclear issue has been adequately addressed, right? Which to me means we have basically said, well, we are going to postpone this issue to the future. We are not going to really address this. Okay, so all right, one can go about and criticize the United States or others for why is it that you have one state in the region which is a nuclear power and others are not, right? What type of dynamics has this set in motion? I mean, I frankly have to laugh when I hear the argument that says we should prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear state because this will set in motion a nuclear arms race in the region. Well, wait a minute. There already is a nuclear state in the region, right? Wake up. That arms race began many, many years ago when Israel became a state, right? How selective do we want to be it on the nuclear issue, be it on the chemical issue, right? Surely, I guess I'm not naive enough to understand why is it that the states adopt the policies that they do. They want to defend their own national interests, the way they see it, right? So, in short, I don't think we can really look for consistency. And all the examples that we are bringing up today about how we behave when the Iraqis use chemical weapons against the Iranian soldiers, etc., I think basically are serving as testimonials to the fact that we are bound to make these contradictory set of decisions based on what every state perceives to be its given national interest at any given conjuncture.
Well, I wanted to add to your point about religious sectarianism, and I think that's a really important one. What we're seeing in Syria, in fact, is, it's not contained to Syria, right? So you have co-religionists coming to support either the Assad regime or the rebels, and they're coming from all over, even as far away as Chechnya. And I know Iraq has been on page 8 or page 12 of the New York Times recently, but the fact that Syria has become the new proxy battle for sectarian conflict in Lebanon and in Iraq is something that, I mean, it's difficult to figure out how to manage that and how to prevent that kind of thing. But that, I think, is one of the really troubling new developments in the region. The fact that so many of the fault lines seem to be over religion rather than other issues, right? And in a sense, you could have other types of fault lines based on class, based on economics, right? And they don't seem to fall out that way. So that's been really to sort of trace the way in which, in my view, that the opposition in Syria has really been hijacked by these elements that have a very different view of what they want in the post-Assad Syria than the homegrown opposition did and the Free Syrian Army did initially.
Yes.
I have a question about deterrence. Just first with distinction. I don't believe the Iraq brand that was deterrence because Iraq did attack Iran, and a lot of unclassified reports show that a lot of those capabilities weren't available at the beginning. It was provided by, I guess, allies of the West. So I wouldn't agree that was a deterrence.
Sorry, you need to explain what's that got to do with deterrence.
No, well, I just want to make a distinction between that and what I believe Syria is, going off the Arab proposal that was either voted down today or yesterday about making Israel join the NPT. If we were to, I guess, it is a bargaining chip for Syria, but if that bargaining chip was taken away, my question is essentially how would that change the U.S. approach when the chemical weapon question isn't? Would we address the larger issue of the large humanitarian violations that were happening, or would we continue the same approach we did 2 years ago when it started, when the reports of chemical weapons weren't essentially as significant as it is today, where we kind of sat back and tried the diplomatic approach, but now it's shifted to a military approach because of the chemical question. So, just my question is, if that bargaining chip is taken away from them, what would you think the U.S. approach would be? Would it continue to be more direct, or would it kind of digress a little bit to how it was?
I don't think the reluctance of the administration to get involved is because they were deterred by the prospect of Assad's chemical weapons. So that's why I'm having trouble understanding how you connect the deterrence conversation here. I mean, I do think that for the reasons that Mehrzad said before, that this is, from Assad's point of view, somewhat problematic because his deterrence vis-a-vis others, especially vis-a-vis Israel, is going to be weakened if he really had to give up chemical weapons. He clearly, he likes to use it against his own people, but I also agree that his principal argument has been as an element of deterrence. Also, by the way, it didn't work that well, at least vis-a-vis the attack on the Syrian reactor. But I think the issue here is more relevant in the context of what the options are for the United States vis-a-vis Iran than there is vis-a-vis Syria.
So we saw in Afghanistan when there was a political act, we saw a civil war of Iran, and this was a long-standing civil war between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance, and it left ungoverned regions, which allowed terrorist groups to operate and plan. Isn't that the larger national security issue here? This war doesn't seem like it's going to come to an end anytime soon. Isn't the larger national security issue with the extremist factions that are there, leaving these areas ungoverned, allowing them to operate, and what that can mean going forward?
So let me agree with Mehrzad on one thing. Let's figure out the other. I mean, that may be right, but that doesn't mean we can do anything about it. I mean, that's the problem. And I think Afghanistan is exactly the right model to ask yourself the question, which is the reason we got involved in Afghanistan was precisely under the logic that you set forth, which is this happened to us once, right? We pulled out of Afghanistan, a vacuum developed, the bad guys came in, and we paid the price. But unfortunately, the lesson of Afghanistan since 9/11 is there's no guarantee that if you get in, that you're going to solve the problem or make it better. And so it's really a question of balancing the risks, but also just because you've identified the problem doesn't mean you know what the answer is. And I think that's Mehrzad's caution here, which is that we don't know. I mean, there is a risk that, even if we got in, that somehow we can't pacify it. And the whole history of the region, going back to the British, as our historians here talk about, suggests how hard it is for outside forces to deal with these internal challenges. And we're not going to go in and become a British imperial presence in Syria the way the Brits were with Gertrude Bell and all the good stuff in Iraq. So I agree, Tom, but I think it doesn't answer the policy question, even though you've identified the right problematic.
It's a great point that you raise, and I think we go back to Libya. I mean, part of the problem is it's not just the going in and intervening, but what you do later. And what the U.S. tends to do later is leave really quickly. And in Libya, all the bad guys kind of infiltrated to Mali. And Mali was, the fact that France, right, intervenes to in a sense, save the people who are being, just being devastated by this takeover of the northern part of the country, right? And so we did intervene there. And I think that what's really troubling is that the fact that groups like the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria and the Al-Nusra Front have control of territory. It's not just they're fighting, but they have control of territory on the Turkish border, and Turkey being a NATO ally. And that it's still going to be problematic to intervene. And it's not, and then what happens if we secure those areas and don't make them safe havens? Can those, can those rebels, right, then just go somewhere else? And that's the porousness of, our globalized era, right? They can go somewhere else. So we have to be vigilant everywhere. We just don't have the resources for that. I think it's going to take a multilateral effort. It can't be something that the U.S. can really do on its own.
Just one point. Look, I think the prospect of Syria becoming a failed state, right, a la Afghanistan, Somalia, and so forth, is really what scares the hell out of policymakers in Washington because of the repercussions of it, right? You guys can pull back and leave at some point, but the neighboring states are there, forever, right? So they are going to try to manipulate stuff to their own advantage. And let's be brutally honest with ourselves. There is a limit to what we can do. We learned that lesson in Afghanistan and Iraq, right? Toppling a state was the easy part. Replacing it with a coherent, viable political system that is going to properly function, right, has proven to be much more of a formidable challenge, right? And we might be looking at the same type of prospects in Syria. 2 weeks ago, 60 Minutes had a nice interview with the CIA official who briefed the president every day, and this guy's argument, was the following. He said, "Look, what we are going to do, what the U.S. should do, is to give enough arms to the opposition so that they can convince Mr. Assad that he needs to come to the negotiating table. But we should not give them so much arms that then the opposition would lose its interest in negotiating, right? In other words, a balance of power between the two sides that convinces both sides to negotiate, right? So I think, perhaps the realization is there now that here is a problem that has gone on for 3 years. The two sides are very strong in terms of their desires. They do not see, eye to eye, and short of a diplomatic solution, right? I think we need to ask ourselves that bigger question of, if not negotiation to settle this thing, what type of Pandora's box are we kicking open? And are we ready? Do we have the appetite, right, for what comes next?
Ask one more question, just to let you guys get to class. And there is food on the 4th floor in either INSCT or 401 when we're done, so keep that in mind. Yes, ma'am.
So Professor Elman and Boroujerdi, you actually just started talking about this. What is the next step? We've heard about clashes on the Turkish border. Lebanon is definitely embroiled. I think I heard about bombings even happening within Lebanese borders. Jordan has huge amounts of refugee populations. The third or the second largest city in Jordan is now a refugee city. What are the next steps? What are we looking at next? Because we've been talking a lot of diplomacy, but facts on the ground, even if we get all of those chemical weapons out, it's not like the fighting's stopping. So what are the next things that we should be looking at?
Mehrzad, it's a great question, and I think that Mehrzad is absolutely right, that there really isn't any other solution other than negotiation, because the problem, really why this civil war has gone on and on and on, is because neither side thinks that they have to go to the negotiating table. Both sides sort of thinks that they have enough patrons that they can continue to fight and eventually prevail. So you have to get both sides into a new state of mind in which they both realize that they can't prevail, that they've lost that patronage, and that they really have no choice other than to sit down and negotiate. And to do that, we really have to involve Russians, the Iranians, right? So I think, again, if I think about silver linings of the last few months, one of them is that we do have, in a way, a rapprochement happening between the U.S. and Russia, which is a good thing. We have a number of interests, not just in the region, but elsewhere, and it's not good for the U.S. and Russia to be on the outs. So, but it does mean sort of accepting that, right? That there does need to be, that in fact, all the patrons, and that includes the Saudis and the UAE, who've been funneling money to the rebels. I mean, everybody has to, in a sense, put a stop to that and really compel the sides to come back to the negotiating table. And we've seen that can, be successful, right, in other places, Bosnia, for example, right? So you need to really sort of get, the sides to realize that they don't have any other choice, and they're not going to prevail in the long term.
So I think the crisis in Syria will have rather serious consequences, right, for a number of neighboring states: Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq, right? And each of these countries are going to be impacted one way or another. They have already been impacted by the refugee flow, as you have mentioned, or even occasional cross-border bombings and so forth. Please remember how porous the borders between these countries are. I was in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon a couple of years ago, and all the cars that were there had the Syrian license plates. Right? I mean, this is where people come for tourism, trade, and so forth and so on. So, this conflict, the vacuum that has been created by the collapse of the system in Syria, surely is going to mean, right, proxy wars in the neighboring states. We are already again seeing signs of that in places like Lebanon, where pro and anti-Assad forces are killing each other off. Right? The Shiite-Sunni sectarian warfare is recreating itself. The Muslim-Christian, right, conflict, again, is showing its ugly head in this region as well. So things have become politicized. That's why I'm saying, look, this crisis is really of significance to us, because it is not going to be limited to Syria itself, right? Some of those states that I mentioned are very close to the United States, right? Jordan and its security, etc. It's crucial for the U.S. I mean, ask how many of American soldiers are in a place like Jordan, right? Yeah. And frankly, there are things going on that baffles me. I mean, for the life of me, I can't figure out, for example, how the Turkish government, with its brand of sort of more moderate Islam, right, is siding with some of the most radical elements in the Syrian opposition. I mean, don't these guys know what comes next, right? I mean, have we not learned this lesson? Right.
I don't think we could have asked for a better last question. Any other words from the panelists?
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.